Welcome to the Spotlight on Video. My name's Anne from Orchid Systems. In this video, we're going to show you how to interact with workflows from your own custom scripts. We're going to be using Extender for the workflows and the scripts, Orchid users to access the workflow console, and we're going to customize the workflow around the Create EFT File process. The topics we're going to cover are what are custom scripts and workflows and how they can interact together, what software is required for custom scripts and workflows, and we're going to do an example custom script and workflow around the Create EFT File approval. And then we're going to test the script and show you the workflow template which is created to support this functionality. Custom scripts are written in Python using the Extender libraries. They can be attached to views or screens and automatically triggered by Extender when the view is loaded into memory or when the UI or screen is opened. They can also be run by Process Scheduler. Workflows, which are written in Extender, can either be manual, where they're started by a user on a screen, automatic if they're attached to a view event, for example to the field or an insert, update or delete of a view, and in which case when the record is inserted or the particular field is changed, the workflow would be automatically started, or they can be started by a custom script. And this is what we're going to do in this video. We're going to have a custom script to start a workflow. The software that's required is Extender, the Customizer or Developer Edition. To interact with the Extender workflow from a custom script, you need Customizer because you need to create a custom script and possibly custom actions in your workflow. And if your workflow or your custom script needs custom tables, then you need the Developer Edition to support your custom script. You also need Orchid users to access the workflow console and to interact with the workflow icons on Sage 300 screens. And in our case, because we're doing a workflow and custom script around the Create EFT File process, we need EFT processing. For the approval of the Create EFT File, the business process that we want is when somebody clicks Create EFT File for a selected batch, that we check that this batch has already been approved for the EFT file to be created. In terms of workflow, we need to check for a workflow instance where the status is approved. But when they click the EFT file, if there is no workflow instance for the batch they have selected, then we want to start the workflow so that the users can be alerted to go and approve that batch before the file can be created. So showing that another way, first the user is going to click Create EFT File, and if there's an approved batch, it'll go ahead and create the file. If there's not an approved batch, it will start a workflow instance for this particular batch number. And then when the batch is approved, then the user can go back and create the EFT file. Signed in as Dan, I'm going to request approval for my AP payment batch number 74. So this is a batch that I have already entered, printed the checks, and posted. So when I go to Create EFT File, I get this message that approval is required to create the EFT file for AP payment batch 74. And I know that Anne has been sent an email to go ahead and approve this batch. I can also see that from my workflow icon. And when I click on my workflow icon, because I'm configured as an Orchid user, I can see that batch 74 has been started, and whoever is able to can either approve or reject batch 74. And any user going to create EFT file for a batch that already has had a workflow instance started will see the green icon indicating that a workflow is in progress for this particular record, and they can see what the status of that workflow is. And if they were to click Create EFT File again, they get the message that the EFT file creation for AP payment batch 74 is not approved. Logging on as Anne, and if I go to my workflow console, and I have access to the workflow console because I am configured as an ORCID user, on my console I see those workflow instances that have been assigned to me. So I see the batch that Dan just submitted, the create EFT file that Dan just submitted for me to approve, but I also see one submitted previously by Albert. And I can see for both these EFT files, I can either approve or reject. I can drill down to the underlying batch. I can look at the history or the values of the workflow. I could reassign if appropriate, or I could delete the workflow instance. If I was to go ahead and accept batch number 75, approve that, you can see my workflow instance status has been updated. It has no next step name, and the color has been changed as well. And if somebody was to go to create EFT file now, who has permissions to create EFT files for batch number 75 and go ahead and click create, the file would be created. When working with workflow and custom scripts, we recommend that you use a flowcharting tool to document the individual steps that you want in your business process automation. And here's one we've created for the custom script and workflow that I've just demonstrated. When the user clicks Create EFT File, the custom script starts automatically. And the custom script checks to see, is there an approved workflow instance for this particular batch? If there is, then it will go ahead and create the EFT file. If there's not an approved workflow instance, it will check to see if there is a workflow instance that is in progress. If there is, it will show the user a message accordingly and tell them to wait until the batch has been approved. But if there is no existing workflow instance, then it will start a workflow instance. And the entry step of the workflow instance will be started, which will set some workflow variables and values, and then show the message that the workflow instance has been started and go to the wait step. And in the wait step, the users can either reject or accept. If they reject, then it will come back to the wait step because the EFT file needs to be created at some stage, but maybe cash flow reasons it's just not now. But if they accept, it will set the status, send an email to the person who submitted the workflow instance and complete the workflow. And because there's now an approved workflow instance, next time somebody goes to create the EFT file, they will be able to click the button and the script will see that there's an approved workflow instance and create the EFT file. First, we'll look at the setup required for the custom script. Then we'll look at the setup required for the workflow. And finally, we'll look at the setup required for the workflow icons on the Create EFT File screen. The script that does the work around the Create EFT File view is this one. And we see when we attach it to the view, we must define 3 parameters. Parameter 1 is the workflow instance that we want to start. Parameter 2 is the user who's going to approve the workflow, and parameter 3 is the approved status that the workflow is going to look for. When the script first runs, it checks to see if the active view is EL0100, so the script is only active on EL0100. And on before process, so before processing an EFT file, first check if the function process has been called with a parameter 0, which is to create the EFT file. If it is not 0, then it will go back to the screen. If it is 0, then it will continue with our script. It sets some variables based on the batch that was selected in the screen, and then runs the function, is there an approved workflow instance? If there is, continue and create the EFT file. If there isn't, go ahead and create the workflow instance. The function is EFT file creation approved, filters the workflow instance table for the workflow name, and checks to see if there is a workflow instance where the step name is blank, so that's the next step is blank, and the status equals the parameter that we pass through, in our case, EFT file created, for the particular batch and view that we're working with, AP or AR. And then it does a browse to see if there are any records. If there is, then it will return true. There is an approved workflow instance. Otherwise, if there isn't, it will return false. There's no approved workflow instance. And if there is no approved workflow instance, then we go to create the workflow instance. And the create workflow instance says, first check if there is a open instance, which is this function here, which will check for the same workflow name, and this time it's not checking if the step name is blank. If there is, then we know there's an active workflow instance in progress. If there isn't, we know there is no workflow instance. If there is an active workflow instance, then we're going to do nothing. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and set our columns and start a workflow instance. We're going to create a workflow instance, tell the workflow to progress to the check step, and to set the approver to the parameter 2. And then we need to go to View Events and Scripts and attach our custom script to the Create EFT File view, which is EL0100. We attach the script to the view and we set our parameters. So parameter 1 is the workflow template that we want to work with. Parameter 2 is the user who's going to be set to approve the workflows, and parameter 3 is the status of an approved workflow instance for this particular workflow. For our workflow, we need to set up our email SMTP details for the email that needs to be sent from our particular workflow template. We were using colors, so we need to define what colors we want to use. And then we need to create our workflow template. So for the Create EFT File workflow template, we have 4 steps. The entry step is check, where we set the status to pending approval, set the description, show the user a message that the workflow instance has started, and assign the color orange, and we go to step wait. And the step wait has 2 progress 2 steps, either approve or reject, and those are the buttons we had on our console and that we saw as part of our workflow icons. If they click approve, it's going to set the status to EFT file approved, assign the color green, and then send an email to the starter that the workflow has been approved and complete the workflow. If they click reject, it's just going to assign the color red and go back to the wait step. And the setup required to see the workflow icons on the Create EFT File screen is this particular configuration in Information Manager options on the Notes DML extender and workflow tray icon. So we configure a extender workflow on the screen EL1001. The field we're connecting to is the from batch, and then we associate it with the workflow. And that is why we had the workflow icons showing around the Create EFT File screen. And in order to access both the workflow console and to see the workflow icons, I need to be configured as an ORCID user. So just having a look at the workflow console, signed in as Anne, I see the workflow instance that I approved previously, and the color is green, the step name is blank, and the status is EFT file approved. And the second batch or workflow instance that I haven't worked on at all is sitting in the workflow console as orange, and the status is pending approval. If I was to go ahead and reject batch 74, the workflow is updated, the status becomes EFT file rejected, and the color goes red. And the next step is still wait. But if I go ahead and approve now, the color is updated, and if I was to go to create EFT file for batch 74, we can see the history of the workflow. Dan started the workflow and rejected the workflow a few times and then approved. And Dan would have received an email that his request for create EFT file approval for batch 74, which has now been approved. We have seen the setup required both for our script and for our workflow templates in order to enforce the create EFT file approval. We had to have administrative services users, we had to have extender workflow colors, we had our extender script to create the workflow instance when the create EFT file was clicked, and we had our workflow template which had the steps that we wanted to follow when the create EFT file was clicked. We also had to configure our ORCID users, both in the IM tray for each and every user that's going to use the console or have access to the workflow icons, and we had to configure which screen we wanted the workflow icons to be around. So EL1001 for the create EFT file. And we also had to link our script to the appropriate view. So we had to link our script to the create EFT file view. And so when the create EFT file button was clicked, if the function call was 0, which is create the EFT file, then the script became active. And then we saw to start the workflow, we clicked create EFT file button on the create EFT file screen. And we progressed the workflow through the workflow console, but we saw we could also have progressed the workflow through the icons on the create EFT file screen. And we had a quick look at the workflow console and the extender inquiries, the workflow summary log to show you the history of all the steps taken in the workflow instance. Thank you for your attention. For more information on Extender and ORCID users or any ORCID product, please go to www.orcid.systems.